Great. Well, welcome everybody to the Curious Times Call for Curious Minds, as our legend is, the Curious series from the Royal Society of Edinburgh. It is a strange time indeed, and a very strange kind of event, of course. We're still all learning how to do these, but it is wonderful to be able to, privileged enough to chair it. Royal Society of Edinburgh, Scotland's National Academy, is very pleased to put on a whole series of these programs during the course of the next few months. We have a program of them. They're quite exciting events. They'll be running from 7th to the 30th of August with insights into all sorts of things, health and well-being, innovation, invention, our planet. And we've got a number of tea and talk events and all sorts of things, and some larger capacity events, including one from Baroness Ashton on European matters. But today, we're going to be doing a session from Professor Antonella Sorace from the University of Edinburgh. I'll say a couple of words about her in a second, but before I do that, I'll just talk a little bit about the format of the event. Professor Sorace will present for 20 minutes. And then there'll be a bit of a discussion and question and answer session, which I shall be working my way through the questions that are submitted. If you want to submit a question, you'll see that towards the bottom of your screen, there is a little box marked Q&A. And what you do is you click on that and you can upload or type in your question, and we can go on from there. And that's the way in which we're going to do it. We are going to record this event. It's going to be live streamed also to the RSE's YouTube channel. So there'll be a little record of the event. So that's all very exciting. And there we go. Well, I'm not going to take too long. I'm just going to quick word to introduce Professor Sorace. She's a professor of developmental linguistics at the University of Edinburgh, as well as being a fellow of the Royal Society of Edinburgh and of the Royal Society of Encouragement of Arts, Manufacturers and Commerce. She is a specialist on the interaction between linguistics, experimental psychology, and cognitive science, which is all very cutting edge these days. But perhaps the thing she's almost best known for is her work on bilingualism, which is the topic of today. And indeed, she is the founding director of the Information Consultancy Centre called Bilingualism Matters, for which you can click a Google for. Is based at the University of Edinburgh, and it's certainly worth a look there. And she was also awarded a Beltane Fellowship for Public Engagement, which suggests that she has that thing which is very important for the Royal Society, which is that notion of outreach and reaching out to the world. So I'm going to shut up now, and I'm going to turn to Antonella to give her presentation for the next 20 minutes. And bear in mind, you have that little Q&A box at the bottom, which you can type in your questions. So thank you very much, and I shall stop my video.
Thank you very much. Yes, can you hear me? Yes, everything okay? Thank you very much, Jeremy. I'm very pleased to be here, and thanks to everybody for joining this session. The title of my talk is fairly provocative. I mean, it's just to make it more interesting, you know, is adult bilingualism, mission impossible. And I'm going to talk about learning languages, not as children, but as adults, and whether you can actually learn a language as an adult. Yes. I'm lucky enough to be working in Edinburgh, where I'm proud to say Edinburgh is one of the best places for studying bilingualism over the lifespan. So we study children who are lucky enough to learn 2 languages from birth. We study children who learn one language first and then another, but we also study young adults who learn a foreign language, for example, at university, and increasingly older adults who start learning a language in their retirement years. So really bilingualism in a broad sense, meaning more than one, I'll come back to this, over the lifespan. Now, why is this an interesting topic, particularly in this country? Because there are particular challenges for language learning in the so-called Anglosphere, where English is either the official or the main language spoken. And that means that people don't have much motivation to learn languages. Because they think that English is the lingua franca, and which it often is. And so what is the point of learning another language? And that leads to what I would call privileged monolingualism in the UK, but also in other areas of the Anglosphere. And that means that, unfortunately, the UK has, or I should say had, given the political situation of Brexit, the worst language skills in the whole of the European Union. And this lack of language skill has been quantified as a huge tax for the UK economy. So this was calculated 3 years ago, a tax of about £48 billion a year due to lack of language skills. Now, so there is a problem for lack of motivation for learning languages, but this is not what I'm going to focus about. What I'm going to focus about is also the lack of confidence that many people have about their own language learning abilities, because people think, well, you know, can I really learn another language well if I'm an adult? So this is what we're going to focus on. And I'm going to give you, first of all, a few differences between learning a language as children and learning a language as adults. And then we're going to look at what research is saying, what research is showing about what it means to learn a language as an adult, how far you can go, but also what the benefits of learning a language are for the brain. So not just benefits for the economy, although indirectly also for the economy and for professional lives and so on, but also for the individual brain. So adult language learning, first of all, let's consider one thing, that adult language learning has a different evolutionary status, if you want, from learning a language as a child. So learning a language as a child or early in life has an evolutionary advantage. Obviously, learning language is essential to become a human being, a functioning human being, in a way that learning a language later in life perhaps isn't. So clearly, if a child is deprived of language input and can't learn any language, that child can't grow up properly from a social, from a cognitive point of view, from all points of view. Learning a language as an adult doesn't have the same function. Now, so if we compare adults' second language learning to children, so learning a language as a child, we see 3 main differences. One is the starting point, the initial state. Obviously, adults have at least another language. They may have 2 if they are lucky enough to have heard and learned more than one language from birth, but at least they have one, whereas children have none, okay? Learning mechanisms, I'll come back to this. So adults can actually learn a language via different routes. And we'll see what this means. Children can't, they don't have a choice. They learn a language simply by hearing it, by being exposed to it. And so for adults, it means that typically adults have less exposure to the language compared to a child, but also they get more feedback on what they're doing. They make errors. They're told, for example, they made an error in a way that children really don't. They're not corrected all the time, fortunately. And adults may get grammatical explanations, so they may understand how the grammar of the language works in a way that a child doesn't need to, because the child's brain is geared up to extract the grammar of a language in a natural way, just by listening to it. Now, so again, if you look at the differences, why does learning a language as an adult seem to be different from learning a language from a child? And there are three differences that are normally pointed out, you know, if you're talking about differences. So learning a language as an adult seems to lack completeness, equipotentiality, and uniformity. I'm going to define these terms. So completeness means how far can you go if you are an adult, okay, compared to a child? And typically, adults seem to stop along the way at some point before reaching what we want to call full mastery of a second language. So many adults reach a learning plateau and they stop. Now, mind you, they may actually stop because they don't need to go any further. So many of us, many adults, actually learn to learn a language for a particular purpose. So for example, they may learn to read a language, but they don't need to speak it. So they stop when they reach their aim. So they don't need to go all the way. But it's typical to consider, and this is a term that was used when I was a student, fossilization, which is a very weird term. You know, it really indicates that, you know, yeah, you can't, you know, as much as you try, you can't go any further. And so, you know, you reach this plateau and you stop. Now, for accents, we know that this is a particular source of difficulty for a second language learner. Can they acquire a native-like accent? Well, in many, many cases, that's more difficult than acquiring the grammar of a language. And why is that? Well, there are many, many different factors. One is could be perceptual. So there are certain characteristics, phonetic characteristics of the language that an adult can't really hear very well. And so they can't actually acquire it and reproduce it. Many adults actually can hear these subtle phonetic distinctions, but they can't reproduce it because producing a correct accent actually is not just a cognitive phenomenon, but it implies some sort of retraining of the articulatory organs. So positioning your articulatory organs in particular ways. So it's not just a cognitive problem, it's an articulation problem. And there are also identity factors. I've met many people who think that they would sound weird if they really sounded native in a second language. So it's not their identity. And so, you know, even if they could potentially sound native and have a very good accent, they don't want to because they don't feel at ease with sounding somebody different from themselves. Now, some languages are more difficult than others. This is what lack of equipotentiality means. For children, any language they are exposed to, a young child will learn that language. No exception. So no languages are more difficult than others. All languages are easy. This is not the case for an adult, because depending on what your native language is, some languages are easier than others. So for me, I'm a native speaker of Italian. Spanish is a relatively easy language because it's typologically closer to Italian. Gallic is a bit more of a difficult language because it belongs to a different typological family. Chinese is even further away in terms of typological difference, and so it's more difficult. And depending on what your native language is, the degree of difficulties may increase or decrease. Also, among adults, there is much more individual variation. So children generally get there, they acquire whatever language or variety of language they are exposed to, they will learn it. For adults, we've already seen some stop along the way, even because they can't go any further, or because they don't need to go any further. But definitely there is much a greater scope for individual variation in adult language learners, in time available, degree of commitment, degree of motivation, reasons why the language is learned, and so on and so forth. So how can adults learn a second language? Adults can basically simplify, can learn a second language in two ways. One is the same ways in which children learn a language. So spontaneously, implicitly, just by hearing it. But also, unlike children, they can learn explicitly and consciously, because their brain can cope with this information about grammar in a way that a very young brain can't. So there's no point in explicitly teaching a language to a one-year-old, because their brain is not capable of coping with that information. But the brain of an adult obviously is able to cope with that information. And that means that adults can actually learn a language in two ways. So many people think that adults can't learn implicitly and spontaneously like children, whereas in fact they can, but they don't get as much input as children. So children, think of children, they're fully immersed in the language they're acquiring. They hear it all the time. They hear it from many people. They're part of the community. Adults, in many cases, don't get much input in the second language, either because they're not part of the second language community, they don't have much time, they learn it in a classroom situation. So the input is much more restricted. And in order to learn a language implicitly, spontaneously, you need a lot of input. Children get that, adults may not get that. Also, they don't have as much time as children, and this is typically underestimated. Children have as much time as their waking hours, for example. Adults don't have as much time. They have a busy life. They have a family. They have a work. They have a job. They do other things, and so that should be borne in mind. So now, having given this a global picture of child-adult differences in language learning, what are the common myths that are there about adult second language learning? Well, as I said at the beginning, many people think, what's the point? You can't really learn a language very well as an adult, so you can't do it unless you're a child. You can only learn through rules and correction. So you go to a classroom, you have a teacher, hopefully a nice teacher, and you learn from the teacher, who corrects you when you make a mistake and teaches you the grammar of the language. Also, as we said, you have a language already. So that language is going to influence the second language. So you're going to make mistakes that are due to the fact that you have another language. And so the grammar of the first language gets transferred to the grammar of the second language. So you make mistakes due to that kind of transfer from the first language. Now, are you ready? Now I'm going to show you what research actually shows instead. So what research actually shows is that it is possible for learners to become native-like. So there are, in fact, many adult learners who reach very high levels of competence in a second language, maybe without reaching, attaining a native-like accent, but definitely, they are native-like in all, if not in most respects, if not in all respects. And these people don't have a different brain from my brain or your brain. These are perfectly normal adults. So they're part of this individual variation that I mentioned before. So some adults don't go very far. Some adults go all the way in reaching very high proficiency in the second language. And these people who reach high proficiency most of what they learn is implicit. So they're not aware of what they know, exactly like a native speaker of a language. What you know explicitly about the language, what you know, the grammar, the grammatical rules that you study in a classroom, that's the tip of the iceberg. Most of what you know, if you know a second language well, is actually implicit. You're not aware what you're doing or why you're doing it, exactly like a native speaker, anybody who's learned a language as a child. And also, this is very interesting, the effects, remember the effects of the first language on the second language, everybody thinks, yes, I mean, that's what happens, right? Well, there are effects of the second language on the first language, which doesn't mean that you lose your native language, but it means that your native language actually changes in predictable ways. And that is actually good for language learning. So we're doing a lot of research on this, and what we are showing is that changes in the native language may actually be functional to success in the second language. So some learners may be better than others at reconfiguring their cognitive space in such a way that the two languages actually come together in certain very selective ways. So, you know, in all bilingual environments, languages are not the same as in monolingual environments, and this is a perfectly normal phenomenon, changes in the native language. What else does research show? Research shows very interesting effects that go beyond language. And this is very, I'm going to summarize these very, very quickly. First of all, actual language learning as an adult changes the brain. And this is something that until, say, 30 years ago, was really not visible in research. So learning another language actually changes the anatomy of the brain. It causes growth of cortical areas of the brain. So there's more gray matter that grows as a result of learning another language. But it also changes the brain at the level of connectivity. So connections within the brain, among areas of the brain. So it enhances connectivity in certain areas of the brain. So even when you start learning a language as an adult, and this shouldn't be too surprising because it's not just the language learning experience that has these effects, but also other types of experiences. They have been found to change the brain because the brain is much more flexible than anybody thought until 30, 40, 50 years ago. The brain maintains a certain degree of flexibility all lifelong throughout the lifetime. So this is not what we are going to focus on, however, because, you know, people may think, oh, okay, my brain has changed anatomically and so on. So what? What we really want to know is whether language learning can change behavior, how people behave in particular ways. And the answer that is coming from research is yes, it can. So for example, and I'm not talking about the effects on children learning a second language. I'm focusing specifically on the effects on adults who learn another language. So adults who learn another language have a better awareness of other people's perspectives. So this is a very important developmental point in all children. Children have to get away from being completely egocentric and appreciate that other people can have different perspectives and different points of view. Now, adults have reached that developmental level, but it has been shown that they are readier, adults who know other languages, they switch from their own egocentric perspective to embrace another person's perspective faster than a monolingual adult. So learning, having other languages actually enhances the ability to understand that other people can have different points of view and different perspectives. It's difficult to underestimate the importance of this in today's societies, but also in professional lives. I'll come back to this, and we can come back to this in discussion. There are effects that have been found on attention, the way we pay attention to whatever we do. We have to pay attention to the task at hand, because if we don't pay attention, we don't do it well. So learning another language actually enhances the control of attention. So the ability to pay attention to what matters for what we're doing, at the same time ignoring or being less distracted by irrelevant information, by other aspects that are not relevant, not important for the task at hand. So better control of attention, and also better ability to handle conflicting information. So better ability to switch from one task to the other. So these effects have been found also in children who learn another language, but interestingly enough, they have been found in adults who start another language as adults. So you don't need to be a bilingual from birth or from childhood to enjoy these benefits. You can actually enjoy them if you learn another language later on in life. Just an example of what I mean by cognitive control, the control of attention. This is a classic task that can be given to both children and adults who can read, obviously. So the easy condition, this is called the Stroop task. The easy condition is, okay, read these words as fast as you can. Fine, you know, blue, yellow, red, purple, black. We don't have a problem. The interesting condition is this. So now the question is, mention the color of the ink in which the words are written as fast as you can. So you have to say yellow, but the word says blue. You have to say red, the color of the ink, but the word says yellow. And so you're slowed down. You're slowed down because you can't help reading the words. You're a proficient reader, so that slows you down. Now, if you're bilingual, again, bilingual in a broad sense, if you know another language, you're slowed down less in the second condition. So you're better at ignoring or reducing the interference of the word you read. Okay, so this is just an example of cognitive control that is enhanced by language learning. Now, these cognitive effects have been found in young adults learning a second language. So we've done research on university students who major in a foreign language, for example. And yes, they have these effects, even if they started learning a language at age 18 and not before. But interestingly, we're beginning to find them in older bilinguals. So people, not only people who have learned a language throughout a lifetime, it has been found that language learning, knowing other languages, actually delays normal aging, so the normal decline of certain cognitive functions, but also certain kinds of pathological aging. The initial symptoms appear 4 or 5 years later in certain kinds of dementia, for example. So do you need to be bilingual from birth in order to enjoy these aging advantages? No, you don't. You need to have learned another language during your lifetime. And in Edinburgh, we have this wonderful set of data. It's called the Lothian birth cohort. This is a huge database of data, cognitive data, collected from people who were born in 1936. So, and data were collected over the years at regular intervals from these people. So we have a lot of individual data over the lifetime of these people. So this gentleman, for example, he was 11 in 1947 when the first data collection took place. And then more data were collected when he turned 70, when he turned 73, when he turned 76. Now, what we know from all these data is that how well you perform at age 11 can partly predict how well you perform at age 73. So, you know, basically there is continuity in the way your brain develops and so on. But there's also interesting effects of having learned another language during the lifetime. So having learned a second language in adulthood, for example, changes those predictions. So the people who learned a second language as adults perform better at age 73, say, than predicted from their performance at age 11 or earlier in life. So really, learning a language as well as other experiences can change, you know, your brain for the better and can change your performance in old age, adding something better to it. So clearly this leads to new myths. You know, if you're bilingual, you don't get Alzheimer's. And unfortunately, I get this question from many journalists as well. This is a new myth because we're not talking about preventing Alzheimer's by being bilingual. We're talking about delaying the initial symptoms of certain kinds of dementia, you know, and it's not just bilingualism that might be able to have that give you that effect, but other experiences. So there's nothing magic about bilingualism. So music training may have similar effects. Other experiences like quilting, which is very fashionable in the United States, physical exercise. So people are studying the effects of different kinds of experiences over their lifetime. But learning a language is arguably more available than many of these experiences. So why not pick up a language even, you know, when you go, when you retire, you know, you have more time in your hands, pick up a language, study the language. So why these effects? The two languages in bilinguals are always active. And so bilinguals, when they speak one language, they have to push the other language or languages off, away. So I'm speaking English to you now, but my brain is working over time to push Italian and the other languages I know out of the way so that they don't interfere with my English, or not, they don't interfere too much with my English. And this constant mental exercise or mental gymnastics is what leads to advantages in handling conflicting information, being able to monitor, control attention better, as we saw before. The benefits are not automatic because there are many other factors that may play a role in bilingualism. So bilingualism is not that you're either bilingual or not, it's more of a continuum. You can be less bilingual or more bilingual depending on your proficiency, depending on your experiences. But the main message is that it doesn't matter which languages we're talking about from this point of view. So there are prestigious languages and languages that are regarded as instrumentally useful. English is #1 in the world, but, you know, Chinese and Spanish, you know, these are widely spoken languages that if you study a language, people think those are the languages that I should learn. But in fact, from this point of view, it's the fact of having more than one in the brain that matters, not which languages, whether they're prestigious, whether they're spoken by billions of people. So from this point of view, there are no more useful or less useful languages. All languages are good, including minority languages. If you're lucky enough to have a minority language at your doorstep, you are lucky because your brain already has the opportunity to learn 2 languages from early on, or to learn another language because it's there. And the last thing I wanted to say, do you need to be a perfect bilingual? No, because a bilingual is not the sum of 2 monolinguals. Remember what I said, your native language changes, you know, so it doesn't make sense to think that you're not a bilingual unless you behave like a monolingual in the second language, or indeed in your native language. So bilingualism is not the sum of 2 monolinguals, which means that we should give up this idea that the native monolingual norm is the point of reference for what we learn. So, your ideal aim, if you learn a second language, is speak like a native speaker, behave like a native speaker. Well, no, it's actually to learn the language to a level that suits your needs and your aims, and it's reasonable enough for you. But in research also, we treat the native monolingual norm as the point of reference. So for example, the advantages of bilingualism or the disadvantages of bilingualism are defined by comparison to what a monolingual does. Well, monolinguals, first of all, are a minority in the world, world-wise, because there's many more bilinguals and multilinguals than monolinguals. But the reason why we use the native monolingual norm is partly due to the fact that most research has been done in monolingual countries, in nation states that are rich enough to fund research, and many of these actually speak English as a native language. And so we should actually give up this idea, also considering that the first language changes. And so it really, bilinguals are really not the sum of two monolinguals. I'm going to stop very soon. Just to conclude, learning languages is very good for you at all ages. So it doesn't matter if you were not lucky enough to learn a language as a child. You can always start learning another language later in life. You may not have the time scale that a young child has to improve, to learn other languages. It doesn't matter if you don't reach very, very high levels of competence in the language. What matters is the experience, the enjoyment of learning another language, and the effects that it can have on your brain. We know that multilingualism is an asset at the individual level, as I described before, at many professional levels. So it's good for business, it's good for cultural relations, it's good from many other points of view. And investing in multilingualism beyond English is very important. And that's why we're doing our best to help people to make good decisions, informed decisions in all sectors of society about their children, for example, about their students, about their patients, about their policies, about their companies if they work in business. So we think that there is a problem often in the sense that there are many myths about bilingualism. People don't have the correct information. So what we are trying to do through my center, Bilingualism Matters, is actually trying to convey, to bridge the gap between research and society so that people can have the correct information, the information based on research rather than myths and misconceptions, and they can make informed decisions about bilingualism and multilingualism. We're doing very well with my center. We now have an international network of 27 branches all over Europe, in North America, including United States and Canada, in the Middle East, and now even in China, in Hong Kong. So we have a wide network that allows us to compare policies, practices beyond research. We're all researchers, but we can compare policies and practices in different contexts, in different countries, in different situations for different languages. And so we can work together to make sure that that people can benefit from being informed, being connected with research. As researchers, we learn a lot by being connected with society. I don't need to explain this perhaps to you. It's a bidirectional advantage. It really goes both ways. So I'll stop here. Thank you very much for listening, and I'm eager to get your questions.
Thank you so much, Antonella, for a fantastic talk and a real piece of what the RSE likes to call useful learning and demonstrating everything the kind of thing we want to do. I'm personally very encouraged because I'm 64 and I'm planning to give myself a real good workout in Spanish when I retire. So I've done that with a certain degree of trepidation. because my daughter, who does speak Spanish, told me, well, that's my language. You don't want to learn that. And I'm going to have to try and learn it in a kind of surreptitious way. We have lots of questions coming in the Q&A. So what I'm going to do is pick up a few of those, and we'll see what sort of things are coming in. Gosh, they're flooding in. So let's take a few at random. The first one which leapt to my mind is to do with learning a language is good for a brain. Someone's asked, this is Diane Gill, asked, learning a language is good for the brain, but is your ability to learn a language in terms of brain physiology as good as it was when you were a child? Which seems to speak very much to my kind of agenda.
As I said before, I think research on the brain, so really neurocognitive research on the brain, has shown that the brain maintains flexibility for much longer than it was usually thought. So when I was a student, which is, well, ages ago, but, not so long ago, depending on your point of view, it was believed that there was a critical period for the acquisition of language. Of a language. So, if you try to learn a language after puberty, particularly the first language, then it's really too late. But partly because the views of the brain were limited by the lack of instruments and methodologies, to study the brain in action. Now that we have the instruments, we know that the brain maintains flexibility for much longer. So the brain shouldn't be thought of as a box, with a finite number of drawers or compartments that, the more you put in the drawers, the less space there is for other things. And therefore, the more you age, of course, your brain is full and there's no space for other. No, I mean, the brain doesn't work that way. So clearly there are certain things that decline with age, but there are certain things that improve with age. So bear this in mind, for example, the ability to reason about language, that's something that children don't have. They can't have, they don't have the maturity to do that. Adults can actually use that route to complement their language learning. Attention improves with age. Paying attention in a focused way is much easier as you grow up than it is when you're a very, very young child. So not everything goes down the drain. Many things improve, and the brain preserves flexibility. And the more you use the brain, the more flexible it remains. So that's why learning languages helps maintaining flexibility in the brain.
Just like use it or lose it. Someone said to me along those lines. Yeah, someone says, thank you for doing the presentation. It's given me a little hope, which I think is rather an encouraging thought. One question which has come up here, which has caught my eye because it connects with something you were saying, is someone says, is there a way to prevent changes in native language while becoming more proficient in second language? And that seems to connect up with what you were saying about how the first language of level 2 speakers change as a result of learning a second language. Could you say a little bit more about that? That was really interesting.
Well, do you want me to speak for an hour or a minute?
Oh dear,
I'm joking. I could really, I mean, this is one of my favorite, one of my area of research, where I actually do a lot of research, and it's very, very interesting because, so first of all, it's completely natural that some changes happen in your native language. Okay, so in fact, we are beginning to think that if your native language doesn't change at all, you don't go very far in learning the second language. So your first language remains, the only source of, the only basis for learning a second language, and whereas the mutual effects may actually facilitate learning a second language. What does it mean that the first language changes? Again, it doesn't necessarily mean that you lose it, particularly if you continue to hear it and and use it. Original research in this area, I mean, and the term is still used, the term attrition, which is negative, right? I mean, it suggests erosion, loss. But the early research on attrition was done on people who emigrated at the beginning of last century. They left their native countries. They went to the United States, for example, and of course, migration was final at that point. There was no internet, no Ryanair or, you know, cheap airlines to bring you back. So really that meant abandoning, you know, your native language communities. This is not what happens to many of us now. You know, we can keep in touch with our native languages. The native language, however, can change in very subtle ways. Not everything changes. And what changes seems to suggest that you can get it back. So if you are re-immersed in your native community, some of these changes regress, which means that it's not that you lose your language, it's access to your language that is reduced. And it can be regained if you are re-immersed in the community. So again, you know, we have to be careful about what it means, you know, to change with that your native language changes. It changes in subtle ways. It changes in ways that are not definitive and not for good.
That's fascinating. It sort of fits with the connectivity thing, doesn't it? You reactivate different connections. Yeah. Someone here is David Hopwood has given a really interesting question. He says, "Is there sense in learning language as an adult by concentrating on input, reading and listening first, and integrating output, writing and speaking at a later stage?" I think he's asking about the relationship between reading, listening, sort of passively, and writing and speaking, going out the other way.
For many adults, you know, reading and listening is all they need, right? They don't need to go much further. You know, they don't need to become fluent speakers, but they need the language for instrumental purposes, for which, you know, being able to read and understand is basic. Let's also think that, you know, comprehension abilities usually precede production abilities, right? So, you know, think again, children, they start by understanding a lot long before they start producing things, right? So being able to understand is a very good basis for being able to produce. So it depends on your needs. It depends on your motivation, right? It depends on the opportunities you have to actually use the languages. Again, there's many opportunities to hear the languages nowadays. You know, there's the internet and you know, many other ways that were not available until fairly recently. In order to use the language, well, obviously you need to interact with other people, and that's the way to improve your speaking abilities. So that may or may not be available. Again, you know, if you're learning a language in a classroom situation, the typical classroom situation, you don't have many opportunities to speak, because you know, you hear your teacher and you're in a class, and so you get a lot of passive input, but not much in the way of active production. So you have to look out, you know, for opportunities to speak the language.
Yeah, I've often said that it's like when you try and teach, trying the best way of learning something is to try and teach it, isn't it? It sort of forces you to formulate your own notions. Very interesting stuff floating around in here. There's a number of people have been asking about questions to do with thinking and speaking, thinking in another language. Like what is meant by that, or what's the evidence for people who think before they speak in their own language, then try and turn it into the language their target. What are your views on the thinking and speaking relationship?
I think when you reach a reasonable level of competence, not necessarily a native-like level, you know, a reasonable level of competence, you think in the native language, in the
target,
second language, in the target language. You don't go through, you know, a process of formulating your thoughts in your native language and then translating them into the second language. You start thinking directly in the second language. And the classic question, you know, that I get asked this question, but I heard many other people asking this question. In which language do you dream? This is the really telling sign, you know, if you
Oh
dream,
dear.
if you
Oh
dream
dear.
in the second language, well, you know, this is anecdotal and it's not very scientific, but you can dream in either your native language and your second language, depending on what you're dreaming about.
I think it's kind of given all the people have been having these funny dreams during lockdown. I think this is that's a very worrying thought. Yeah, someone's raised a question here. It's a totally fascinating presentation. So many. How do they actually calculate the cost to the economy of the lack of language skills? That seems quite an interesting question. I remember.
Well, I can send you the
Yeah. How do they do that?
reports have been written. In fact,
Yeah.
that figure comes from several reports, you know, by
Yeah.
nationwide agencies and so on. I mean, I think, you know, it is a worrying sign because we are dealing with the business world, for example, more and more often. And there, you know, I mean, the assumption is that everybody speaks English, right? So if you're a British business person, if you're a British company, for example, I mean, you have an advantage because you're speaking your native language, and other people, you know, are actually speaking English as their second language. Is that really an advantage? Even some of the things I said before, it may not be an advantage. In fact, it's our counterpart, you know, who speaks English as the second language, who may have an advantage because in terms of perspective taking, for example, in terms of understanding where proposals, you know, come from, and being able to have a better view of, you know, where a deal is going to.
Very important in terms of things like empathy, isn't it? The ways in which people think along those lines. You know, my great aunt was the great one for saying, well, foreigners really understand English, they're just pretending. And I think that was her view. And I remember her as being a very unempathetic person. A couple of therapy questions have come up. I see in the blurb here. One of them is, of course, the one you picked up to do with Alzheimer's and things like that. But someone else has asked an interesting question to do with ADHD, attention deficit disorder questions. And I wonder if anything can be looked at with there.
I'm not a specialist in this domain, and
Yeah.
I think studies have been done, research is being done on the possible relationship between bilingualism and this type of condition. So if whoever asked the question, could you send me an email, and I can definitely dig out, you know, some references and send it to you. You know, I'm much more familiar with other areas in which bilingualism has been shown to be not a problem, but actually an aid, if you want. So, for example, autism is an area where if a child is autistic, wherever they are on the spectrum, many speech therapists, you know, and pediatricians and so on suggest that perhaps more than one language is not good because the child is already struggling with one. And so, but in fact, you know, there is research that is beginning to show, including our own, but not only our own, that actually being autistic is not a disadvantage, but it can be an advantage. Again, in terms of empathy, for example, it can partly compensate, you know, the typical lack of empathy that is one of the manifestations of autism. You know, the inability to put yourself in other people's place. So there is some research on this, and I'll be happy to provide references.
Interesting. A couple of other questions have been, well, they're flooding in now. Here's a question which has leapt out to my eye. What do you have to say about learning vocabulary as an adult? I find vocabulary much harder. I can pick up structure and pronunciation of my target language, but learning my vocab
That's a very interesting
is a great struggle. And certainly the way I was taught vocab at school, we had our vocab books and that kind of thing. But that does seem to be a question, different levels of language.
Actually, that question is interesting because for years, research actually, or many people thought that vocabulary is something that you can learn all lifelong. But grammar is something that is best learned as a child.
Okay.
Because learning grammar, might depend on, especially if you believe in, a Chomskyan model of language, that there is a language faculty that, all children are born with, but adults may not necessarily maintain. So, learning grammar depends on that, and therefore it's easier at earlier stages in life. But vocabulary depends on memory and, different learning mechanisms. And so those are available all lifelong. So that would be the opposite of what the question is asking. In fact, learning vocabulary, yes, it depends on memory. Learning grammar also partly depends on memory. So I guess, it depends on individual differences. As I said, there are individual differences in second language learning. There are people who are better at learning accents than grammar, for example, or learning vocabulary than grammar, or learning grammar rather than vocabulary. So, there may be preferences due to individual differences, which doesn't mean that you can't learn what you're less good at. It means that you can follow different routes, or you can invest more time in learning. So we're not at the stage where we can diagnose, or give a complete individual profile for individual learners, so that we can tell people, oh, you should be doing this or that, to improve your language learning abilities. But in principle, maybe this is what might become possible in the future.
Yeah, fantastic. Yeah, the question comes up occasionally: is there a target language which is more challenging in vocabulary terms? Because English, after all, has a very wide vocabulary drawn from all sorts of languages, which it's pinched from. Whereas I don't know about that.
I don't think languages are widely different with respect to vocabularies. Vocabularies are very wide, and in all languages, and the vocabularies that people learn have to do with their own experience. Right? I mean, there are areas in which I completely lack vocabulary because I lack experience. So I wouldn't know how to call things, but there are people who specialize in these areas and their vocabulary is very wide. So, but all languages can express things. So there are no languages that are poorer than others in terms of expressive vocabulary.
Yeah, fascinating. There's been a number of questions coming in about Hungarian here, which I think is quite interesting. Here's someone who says, I experimented with implicit learning when studying Hungarian, and yes, Klingon. Although I found I was constantly trying to work out the grammar on an inductive basis and got frustrated when I couldn't, I did find that I remembered the language in chunks. In sort of chunks, as though you were sort of chunking your language. Well, that's quite interesting. I wonder whether that's something you could talk about.
Yes, very briefly. There were some, and there are some famous theories of second language learning and acquisition that actually assume that at the beginning, adult learners start by learning chunks. And then later on, these chunks get analyzed into their components. And so people start acquiring the grammar, but particularly learners who are immersed in an environment, right, where they learn the language through immersion, through exposure. The assumption is that they may not learn the nitty-gritty of the grammar immediately, but they might actually learn chunks, unanalyzed chunks. And then later on, if they progress further, they might actually decompose these chunks into their components. If they don't go any further, if they fossilize at the very early stages, then their learning is still in terms of chunks.
That's fascinating. That's fascinating. Sometimes it reminds me of how some people think of music and play musical instruments where you do it in chunks, which is quite intriguing. We've got time for one last question. And I think I'm going to finish this off with one which by an anonymous attendee who asks you, Antonella, which language do you curse in when you stub your toe?
It's the alternative to the question, you know, which language do you dream in? It's actually a very, very interesting question. I think I would swear in English at this point, but because I'm now in Edinburgh. But if I spend time in Italy and I'm surrounded by Italians, maybe I would swear in Italian.
It's something obviously we've got to keep our eye on. I think that's well, I've lived in Scotland long enough these days, so I tend to use words like jings, which I think has been around for a long time. Well, look, thank you so much, Antonella, for a fascinating conversation. And thank you so much also to the audience. I know it's been rather a strange way of doing these events, but I'm most grateful for a fascinating selection of questions. Which are
and I'm willing to answer any other questions. Please send them to me. I'm sorry that we can't, you know, go much further, but I'll be very happy to answer questions. I mean, I learn a lot from questions as well. So please, you know, send me questions and I'll do my best to answer them.
Well, that's wonderful. Thank you so much. Now, I have a couple of things I have to mention. We've got some upcoming online events in the Curious sequence. We've got 2 more panels on the following Wednesdays coming up. And there are tea and talk group discussions on various topics like sustainability, genetics, saving the oceans, and applied gaming. So if you want to move into those sorts of areas, that's the sort of thing that we have on offer. But I'm very grateful for everybody here for this event. It's been fantastic. And I think we now say thank you to our speaker, Professor Sorace of Edinburgh University. Thank you to the Royal Society of Edinburgh and Katrina and her team for setting it all up. And goodbye.
Thank you, Jeremy. Bye.
My pleasure. Bye-bye.